It was a place they'd only heard whispers about, a place at the edge of their childhood memories, where waves crashed against jagged rocks and the wind howled like a mournful ghost. The Hollow Point Lighthouse stood alone on the cliffs, its once proud beam long extinguished. The three siblings, Nina, Caleb, and Jonah, had driven hours to get there, drawn by a letter from a lawyer, stating that the property had been left to them by a mysterious benefactor. None of them had even known they had any claim to such a place, but the letter had hinted at answers to questions about their past they'd never dared to ask. The road leading to the lighthouse was overgrown, the asphalt crumbling away as nature slowly reclaimed it. The car jostled and lurched as Caleb navigated the winding path, the lighthouse's silhouette growing larger with each turn. "This place gives me the creeps," Nina muttered from the back seat, her eyes wide as she stared out at the fog rolling in from the ocean. "It's just old," Jonah replied, though his voice lacked conviction, "and we've seen worse on those ghost hunting shows we used to watch." "This isn't a show, Jonah," Nina shot back, her tone sharp. "This is real, and we have no idea what we're getting ourselves into." The car came to a stop in front of the lighthouse, its stone exterior weathered and crumbling. The iron railing of the balcony twisted and rusted. A single door, heavy and warped, stood as the entrance, its paint long peeled away. "This is it," Caleb said, killing the engine. He turned to his siblings, his face set in a grim expression. "We go in, we look around, and we get the hell out. Agreed?" Nina nodded, swallowing hard. Jonah hesitated but eventually nodded as well, though his eyes were fixed on the towering structure before them. The air was thick with salt, and the wind whipped around them as they stepped out of the car carrying the distant cries of seagulls. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, a mix of gravel and sand that crunched with each step. Caleb led the way, the key the lawyer had sent them clutched tightly in his hand. He hesitated for only a moment before sliding it into the lock and twisting it open with a groan that echoed in the stillness. The interior was as bleak as they'd expected, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards creaking under their weight. Dust hung heavy in the air, disturbed by their movements, and the smell of mildew permeated everything. "This place is a dump," Jonah muttered, running a hand through his shaggy hair. "Why would anyone leave this to us?" "I don't know," Caleb replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we're here to find out." They moved through the lower levels of the lighthouse, finding nothing but remnants of a life long abandoned, rusted tools, rotting furniture, and books whose pages had fused together with damp. The place felt frozen in time, as though its last occupant had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. It wasn't until they reached the spiral staircase leading up to the light chamber that they found something out of place. A portrait hung on the wall, its frame thick with dust, the glass cracked. The figure in the painting was a man in his late 40s, dressed in the uniform of a lighthouse keeper. His eyes were cold, his expression stern, but there was something familiar about him, something that made Nina's breath catch in her throat. "Does he look like—" she started, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Caleb said, his voice rough, "he does. It was their father. Or at least it looked like him, but that was impossible. Their father had died when they were young, or so they had always been told. He had been a distant figure, more a memory than a person, and their mother had never spoken of him after his death." "Why is he here?" Jonah asked, his voice cracking as he stared up at the portrait. "I don't know," Caleb said, tearing his eyes away from the painting, "but we're going to find out." They continued up the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the entire structure groan. When they reached the top, they found the light chamber in disrepair, the glass shattered, the lantern rusted and forgotten. But it wasn't the state of the room that made them stop dead in their tracks. It was the figure standing in the center, staring out at the sea. It was a man, his back to them, dressed in the same uniform as the one in the portrait. His presence was impossible, and yet there he stood, as real as any of them. "Dad?" Nina's voice was barely a whisper, but the figure turned at the sound, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. The features were distorted, the skin pale and translucent, as though the man was made of mist. His eyes, once cold and stern, were now filled with a deep, unending sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here," the ghostly figure said, his voice a hollow echo that sent chills down their spines. "This place is cursed, just as I am." "Who are you?" Caleb demanded, stepping forward despite the terror gripping his heart. What do you want from us? I am the keeper of this light, the figure replied, his voice wavering. And you are my children, but not in the way you think. What does that mean? Jonah asked, his voice trembling. It means your father was not the man you knew. He was a man who sought power, who made a pact with forces beyond understanding. This lighthouse, it was his domain, his prison. And when he died, I took his place, bound to this place, cursed to keep the light burning, to warn those who come too close. Warn them of what? Nina asked, her eyes wide with fear. Of what lies beneath the waves, the ghostly keeper replied, his voice dropping to a whisper, of the darkness that dwells in the depths, waiting to drag the unwary down into its cold embrace. The siblings exchanged glances, their minds reeling with the revelation. Their father had been a man of secrets, a man who had made a deal with something dark and terrible. And now they were caught in the aftermath of his choices. We have to leave, Caleb said, turning back towards the stairs. But as he did, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, the sound reverberating through the chamber. There is no leaving, the keeper said, his form flickering like a candle flame. Not until the light is restored, not until the pact is broken. And how do we do that? Jonah asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The keeper turned his gaze to the shattered lantern, its pieces scattered across the floor. The light must be reignited, but the flame must be pure. You must find it within yourselves, to face the darkness, to confront the sins of the past. The siblings hesitated, fear and uncertainty warring within them. But they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. What do we have to do? Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The keeper's form flickered again, growing more transparent with each passing moment. You must descend into the depths, he said, his voice growing fainter, into the heart of the lighthouse, where the darkness waits. With those final words, the keeper vanished, leaving the siblings alone in the cold, empty chamber. The wind howled outside, the waves crashing against the rocks below, as if the sea itself was alive, hungry for their souls. This is insane, Nina said, her voice trembling. We can't do this. We have to, Caleb replied, his voice hard. We can't leave until we do. Then let's get it over with, Jonah said, his voice hollow. The sooner we finish this, the sooner we can leave. Together, they descended the stairs, the shadows lengthening around them as they ventured deeper into the lighthouse. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until it felt as though they were walking through a living thing, something that watched and waited with malevolent intent. The stairs ended at a door, old and rotting, with a heavy iron lock. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before lifting the key and sliding it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that sloped down into the darkness. This is it, Caleb said, his voice echoing in the confined space. The passage was claustrophobic, the walls close and damp, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The only light came from the small flashlight Caleb held, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Nina stumbled over something on the floor, and when she pointed the flashlight down, she saw what looked like old bones, brittle and yellowed with age. Are those... She started, but Jonah shook his head. Don't think about it, he said. Just keep moving. The passage opened into a larger chamber, a cavernous space beneath the lighthouse where the walls were slick with moisture, the ground uneven and treacherous. In the center of the room was a pit, a yawning black hole that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sea. This is where it ends, Caleb said, staring down into the abyss. Or maybe where it begins. How do we restore the light? Nina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the pit, the blackness within it pulsing as if alive. Jonah edged closer, his face pale, his body trembling. There has to be something here, something that, I don't know, ignites the light. They spread out, their flashlights darting around the chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, ancient symbols carved deep into the stone, their meanings lost to time. Jonah stopped in front of one particularly large symbol, a circle with a jagged line running through it, almost like a lightning bolt. He reached out to touch it, but a sudden gust of freezing wind made him pull back. Did you feel that? Jonah asked, his voice tight with fear. Nina nodded, rubbing her arms as the temperature continued to drop. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, chilling them from the inside out. The light, Caleb said, turning to face the pit. It's in there. What? Nina's voice was filled with disbelief. How can it be in there? I don't know, Caleb admitted, his eyes locked on the abyss. But I can feel it. Something down there is waiting for us, for one of us. Are you saying we need to go down there? Jonah asked, his voice barely a whisper. Not all of us, Caleb replied, his expression grim. Just one. No, Nina said, shaking her head. No way. We do this together, or not at all. You don't understand, Caleb said, turning to face his siblings. This is what the Keeper meant. One of us has to go down there, face whatever's in that pit. It's the only way to break the curse, to set things right. You don't even know what's down there, Nina argued, tears welling up in her eyes. It could be a trap. It doesn't matter, Caleb interrupted, his voice firm. This is our only chance. Jonah stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. If anyone's going down there, it's me. No, Caleb said, shaking his head. It has to be me. I'm the oldest. It's my responsibility. We're in this together, Jonah insisted, and you're not doing this alone. Before Caleb could respond, a low rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, the ground beneath their feet shaking. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. It's starting, Caleb said, his voice filled with urgency. I need to go now. Nina rushed forward, grabbing Caleb's arm. Please, don't do this. Caleb looked down at his sister, his expression softening. I have to. It's the only way to save us. With that, he pulled away from her grasp and stepped toward the pit. The darkness within seemed to shift and pulse, as if sensing his approach. The rumbling grew louder, the glow from the symbols intensifying. Caleb took a deep breath and looked back at his siblings one last time. Take care of each other, he said, before turning and lowering himself into the pit. Caleb, no, Nina screamed, but it was too late. Caleb's form disappeared into the darkness, swallowed whole by the abyss. For a moment there was only silence, the chamber deathly still. Then, from deep within the pit, a blinding light erupted, flooding the chamber with a brilliance so intense it forced Jonah and Nina to shield their eyes. The light surged upward, filling the room with a warmth that pushed back the cold, banishing the shadows and the darkness. The rumbling grew louder, the entire lighthouse shaking, as the light shot up through the ceiling, out through the tower, and into the night sky, igniting the beacon that had been dark for so long. But the light wasn't pure. It was tinged with something darker, something malevolent. The glow from the symbols on the walls twisted and warped, their once faint light growing brighter, more sinister. The ground beneath them cracked and split, the chamber collapsing in on itself as the light continued to grow. Nina and Jonah stumbled back, watching in horror as the pit closed in on itself, sealing Caleb within. The light continued to burn, its intensity growing until it was almost unbearable. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light vanished, leaving the chamber in complete darkness. The rumbling ceased, the ground still once more. Nina collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Caleb. Jonah stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The light had returned, but at what cost? Caleb was gone, lost to the darkness, sacrificed to break a curse that had plagued their family for generations. But as the last echoes of the rumbling faded away, Jonah noticed something strange. The symbols on the walls, once glowing with a faint light, had changed. They were no longer just symbols. They were words, written in a language he could barely comprehend, yet somehow understood. Lux in tenebris, he whispered, the words rolling off his tongue like an incantation. Light in the darkness. Nina looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. What did you say? It's Latin, Jonah replied, his voice hollow. It means light in the darkness. Nina shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. But what does it mean? What did Caleb do? Jonah turned to look at the pit, now sealed shut, the darkness within it finally at rest. He became the light, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He sacrificed himself to keep the darkness at bay. The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of Caleb's sacrifice pressing down on them. They had come seeking answers, and they had found them at a price too great to bear. As they made their way back up the stairs, the lighthouse seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted. The light at the top burned bright, casting its beam out across the ocean, a beacon of hope in the night. But for Nina and Jonah, there would be no peace. They had lost their brother, And in doing so, they had uncovered a truth too dark to forget. The lighthouse stood as a reminder of the price their family had paid, a warning to all who dared to venture too close to the edge of the world. And somewhere, deep within the walls of the lighthouse, a ghostly keeper watched over the light, his sorrowful eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the day when the darkness would return, and the cycle would begin anew.